Hi you guys. So today the video I'm making is for helping you guys to do an assignment called Who Was Charles Darwin? Um, there's of course written directions, but I know a lot of people like to have the directions out loud, and it probably will be helpful for you to have some little tips that I'm going to give along the way. So you do not have to watch this video if you don't mind reading the directions. And if you don't want the article that's with this assignment to be read to you. So if you don't need either of those things, then you can just skip this one. This is just for if you want extra help or if you're having trouble with the assignment. So the first thing you need to do is open the document called Who Was Charles Darwin Assignment. So that's this one. I'm going to open it up and it has some directions in it. So if you look at the rest of these directions, it says follow the directions in the video. If you would like to know what this assignment's going to include, there's two parts. First, you're going to write a biography of a dude named Charles Darwin. Second, you're going to write about how did he come up with the idea of evolution, the idea of natural selection, because that's what he's really famous for. So if you want to watch this video, that was step number 3. And then just to let you know, after you finish this assignment, you are going to be doing a quiz. The quiz on the next assignment is going to be helping you to answer the question, what is evolution, which is one of our essential questions for this particular term. So really be thinking about what is evolution. The little quiz is going to have you write a paragraph that answers that question. So you're going to have to write 5 sentences. What is evolution? And you can't just copy things off the internet to do that. I want you to think of them from your own mind and write those things down. So if you need to study up, you can. The other questions will be multiple choice. If you want to do the assignment again because you fail it, of course, I'm cool with that. I just want you to learn the stuff. So if you don't learn it the first time, let's do it the next time. All right, let me go back to the assignment so we can look at these directions. All right, so it says go to the website about Charles Darwin. So I'm just going to follow the directions right here. This is the website. I like the BBC as a source. It stands for British Broadcasting Corporation or Company, actually. I'm not 100% sure. But this is a really reputable source. So if you are using something from the BBC, it's probably going to be science-based. They do their research. If it's an opinion piece from the BBC, that might be a little bit different for a resource. It might not have all the information that you need. All right, so I just want to tell you, while you're reading this article, you should probably write down a few little notes. I made a space for you to do that here. The reason that you can write down some notes is because you're going to write a biography about Charles Darwin. So if you have a few keywords or few things that you thought were really important, it'll be helpful for you writing your biography in a second. All right, I'm just going to read this article to you because sometimes people like to have things read out loud. One thing I'll say is if there's a word on here that you don't know, look it up. So pause the video, look up that word, and that'll help your understanding too because these articles are written by people who are professionals and they have a lot more experience with writing than you might because you're just a teen right now. So sometimes they use words that we don't know yet, and so we need to look them up. All right, Charles Darwin, Evolution and the Study of Our Species. The man who struggled with his own ideas. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection made us rethink our place in the world. The idea that humans shared a common ancestor with apes was a challenge to the foundations of Western civilization. Darwin kept silent for 20 years before going public and was only half joking when he described his book on the origin of species as like confessing a murder. This story a one-man struggle with the most radical idea of all time. So let's find out what that idea was. All right, so 12th of February 1809. Born into a free-thinking family. Charles Robert Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, Shropshire, the 5th of 6 children and he had wealthy and connected parents. The young Charles had a quietly Christian upbringing, but his family life was one of openness to new ideas. His grandfathers had both been important figures in the Enlightenment. Josiah Wedgwood, an industrialist and anti-slavery campaigner, and Erasmus Darwin, a doctor whose book Zoonomia had set out a radical and highly controversial idea, one that species could transmute into another. 1825. New ideas in Edinburgh. Following the footsteps of his father and grandfather, Darwin secured a place at Edinburgh University to study medicine. He didn't make a good medic. This was long before an anesthetic, and Darwin found the brutal techniques of surgery too stomach-churning to handle. But there was an upside. Edinburgh was one of the best places in Britain to study science. It attracted free thinkers with radical opinions that would not have been tolerated in Oxford and Cambridge. Among other things, Darwin heard speakers talk about the latest theories of transmutation, as evolution was then known. 1827. Collecting beetles in Cambridge. Abandoning plans to become a doctor, Darwin now considered a career in the church. Aged 18, he went to study divinity at Cambridge. Though he held fairly conventional beliefs in God, Darwin wasn't particularly keen on this new direction. But training to be a clergyman meant that he had plenty of time to pursue his real passion, biology. You guys might not know this, but historically, people who were part of the church were actually the scientists because they knew how to read, and a lot of people didn't know how to read. So monks used to do a lot of our scientific work. Now the church is kind of opposed to religion. I mean, the church is opposed to science sometimes, but that is not how it was in the past. He spent much of his time collecting beetles and walking on the fens. He graduated in 1831, but before he could take a job as a cleric, the chance of a lifetime would come his way. 1831. Setting sail around the world. Darwin's tutor at Cambridge recommended him as a gentleman naturalist on a voyage around the world on the HMS Beagle. That's a boat. Darwin jumped on the chance. Over the following 5 years, Darwin visited 4 continents, spending much of his time on land collecting specimens and investigating the local geology. He also had long periods of nothing to do but read and reflect. Books such as Charles Lyell's recently published Principles of Geology had a profound impact, making him think about slow processes which occur over a vast amount of time. During the trip, Darwin also suffered terrible seasickness, the start of a life dogged by illness. 1835. The Galapagos Islands. Leaving South America behind, the HMS Beagle made a 5-week stop at the Galapagos Islands, 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador. The Galapagos Archipelago is a collection of small volcanic islands, each with a distinct landscape. Contrary to popular belief, Darwin did not have a great eureka moment in the Galapagos. He studied finches, tortoises, and mockingbirds there, although not in enough detail to come to any great conclusions. But the steady accumulation of observations was building up. Just as an aside, there's 2 little videos here, and I recommend watching them. I'm not going to play them here because you can watch them, but I would say watch them. 1838. Darwin drafts his first account of evolution. Home again, Darwin showed his specimens to fellow biologists and began writing up his travels. A powerful, elegant idea began to emerge in his mind. Darwin saw how transmutation happened. Animals more suited to their environment survive longer and have more young. Evolution occurred by a process he called natural selection. Darwin struggled with the idea because it contradicted his Christian worldview. His grandfather had been ostracized for writing about transmutation, and he feared the same fate. He decided to gather more evidence before going public. In the meantime, he made his name by publishing an account of his travels. Darwin worries himself sick. In 1851, Darwin's favorite daughter, a 10-year-old Anne, sickened and died. Darwin also grew ill, suffering long bouts of nausea. Illness had become a recurring feature of his life. He had spent long periods shut away at a home, nursed by Emma. Historians offer many explanations for Darwin's symptoms. Some suggest a tropical disease. Others argue his symptoms were largely psychosomatic, brought on by anxiety. Periods of sickness often coincided with stressful events. His health would grow worse when the time came to go public with his new theory. 1858. The Letter That Lit a Fire. By the summer of 1858, Darwin had written 250,000 words on evolution and published none of them. Then a letter compelled him to go to public. Alfred Russel Wallace was an admirer of Darwin's. Inspired by the Beagle voyage, Wallace set off traveling. He independently arrived at a theory of natural selection and wanted Darwin's advice on how to publish. Darwin realized that if he didn't go publish it quickly, then Wallace would take credit for his new ideas. But Wallace was abroad and uncontactable. This left Darwin in a moral quandary. As well as agonizing over whether to speak out, he had to decide how to treat Wallace fairly. 1858. Darwin and Wallace rewrite the theory of evolution. Darwin finally went public with his groundbreaking theory of evolution by natural selection, while making sure that Wallace received some credit. Darwin's ideas were presented to Britain's leading natural history body, the Linnean Society. After consulting with colleagues, Darwin agreed that extracts from his and Wallace's papers should be presented at the same meeting. Wallace, on his return, accepted that Darwin had treated him fairly. But Darwin missed the presentation. A private tragedy had struck. His son died of scarlet fever, aged just 18 months old. November of 1859. Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Still racked by doubt, Darwin finally published his new theory of evolution. It would become one of the most important books ever written. Darwin described writing it as living in hell. He dreaded losing his reputation his grandfather Erasmus had. Charles did draw fierce criticism from the church and from some parts of the press. Many people were shaken by the book's key implication, that human beings were descended from apes, though Darwin only hinted at it. However, some were now willing to listen to the evidence for evolution, especially from a leading figure like Darwin. June 1860. Evolution on trial at Oxford University. Darwin was reluctant to defend his ideas in public. It was left to others, notably a young biologist named Thomas Huxley, to take up the fight. In the 19th century, scientific topics were popular entertainment, and any debate about evolution was sure to draw crowds. Huxley's most famous clash came at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. In what many saw as a key battle between science and God, Huxley went head-to-head with the Bishop Samuel Wilberforce and his biblical account of creation. Both sides claimed victory, and the debate has become part of the Darwin legend and shows how his ideas shook Victorian society. 1862. A Worrying Inheritance. Darwin wrote a warning about close relatives having children, buried in an obscure botanical text. He was already worried about his own marriage. Darwin and his cousin Emma had 10 children, and Charles was a devoted father. Yet the couple had lost a son and 2 daughters, and nursed others through illness. Darwin knew that orchids were less healthy when they self-fertilized, and worried that inbreeding within his own family may have caused problems. Yet, when Charles lobbied to add questions on cousins' marriage in the 1871 census, he was refused. Queen Victoria had married her cousin, and Darwin was challenging another taboo. So inbreeding and marrying your cousins and having incestuous relationships now is like, really a bad idea. You're not allowed to marry your cousin. Well, your first cousin. I think you can marry your second cousin, but don't count me on that because I haven't looked up the law. So Darwin was one of the people who saw like, hey, like if you keep marrying your cousins, then your kids get sick. And there's actually genetic reasons for that, which we'll discuss in another biology class. But he was even looking at himself because he had married his cousin and his children were very sick. That's something that shows up, and that's the reason we have laws against that now, is that when you have a family that's, inbreeding together, then the same diseases stay within their genetic gene, like their genome, and then more people can get sick more often. But don't judge Darwin or really anyone of that time of marrying their cousins. Throughout most of human history, people have married their cousins. If you look at any royal family throughout history, they all were inbreeding because they believed that their blood was precious and pure and they didn't want it to mix with the commoners. So that is something that we now have to look at with cultural relativism, relativisticism. We have to be respectful of what people did in the past, even if it's different than what we do now. We have a better understanding that marrying your cousins is a good idea now, but they didn't really know that back then. 1869, Survival of the Fittest, the name of this class. Origin of Species was a bestseller worldwide, and it went on to multiple editions. With each new edition, Darwin strengthened his arguments. By responding to critics, he was able to build a more robust case. So when people asked him questions and he had to defend himself, he actually came up with better reasons and more support for his theory of evolution. For the 5th edition, he introduced the phrase survival of the fittest, borrowed from a philosopher, Herbert Spencer. The phrase has become shorthand for Darwin's idea. Unlike natural selection, it doesn't imply a divine being selecting anything. Darwin now described himself as an agnostic, a term coined by Huxley. February 1871. Darwin publishes The Descent of Man. More than a decade after his Origin of Species, Darwin found the courage to publish ideas he had only once hinted at. In The Descent of Man, he presented an unequivocal account of human evolution. The book was another challenge to Christian orthodoxy. Yet, in the decades since Darwin had gone public, his ideas had gained acceptance. Victorian society remained deeply divided about the idea that humans shared an ancestor with apes, but many respectable thinkers were now Darwinists. All right, the end of this story. April 19, 1882. Darwin dies. Still troubled by ill health, Darwin worked until the end. He died a virtual recluse, surrounded by his wife and a few devoted friends. In his final months, Darwin was tended by Emma, who had stood by him despite their differences in religious belief. Realizing that his powers were fading, he described the local graveyard as the sweetest places on earth. Yet his followers, including the indomitable Huxley, had grander plans. He was buried at Westminster Abbey. So Darwin was just like, bury me out back. But then the scientific community said, no, we're going to bury you at this important place because of your important scientific contributions. Okay, a couple of things I just want to point out about this. If you don't know what scientific theory means, I strongly recommend you look it up. When I say I have a theory that the dot isn't going to get up today, that's my nickname for my daughter, the dot. Like, she's not going to get up till noon because she didn't yesterday. Like, that's just an idea that I have based on something I saw. In science, when we have a scientific theory, it means we have a bunch of evidence and we can run tests and all of the evidence supports the theory. So that's what a scientific theory is. It's not just someone's wild idea. It's basically saying like, yeah, we have a lot of evidence to support this and we don't have any other better idea of how things came to be. I'm going to go back to the assignment now so we can look at the directions that are up next. Okay. So hopefully you took some little notes here while I was reading, and hopefully you were following along. And you're going to write a biography of Charles Darwin's life. So that article, it touched a little bit on his science, but it wasn't too much about his science. So here, I just want you to focus on who he was. The first paragraph is going to be his personal life. So here you can talk about his wife. You can talk about his family, how his parents were, or his grandparents were great scientists. Here we're just going to look about him as a person, okay? What was his scientific reputation? In paragraph 2, you're going to talk about his scientific discoveries. So what is evolution? What did he say happened? And you can talk about his time like in the Galapagos and stuff in this paragraph. Here's where your 2 paragraphs need to go, right here. All right, let's move on to part 2. Part 2 is a video. So I'm not going to click on the video, but if you click on it, it's going to open up the video. You need to watch it. While you're watching it, I really want you to think about the science this time. How did he come up with this idea of evolution by natural selection? If you haven't noticed, I'm saying evolution by natural selection a lot. That's because it's a really big deal in this topic. You've got to focus on that. That's a statement that you should have when you're talking about evolution. Evolution by natural selection. Figure out what that means and write a paragraph about how Darwin came up with that idea. All right, I think that's all I have to say. When you're done with this, you just got to turn it in and then make sure you're studying for that test because you do have a test on evolution and what it is. There's basically only 2 assignments that are on this. The last one was myths and misconceptions about evolution, and then this one is about Charles Darwin. So we're going to answer that question, what is evolution? Alrighty, I hope you have a good day, guys.